On April 30th, 1697, a dramatic and violent escape unfolded on a remote island in the Merrimack River. Hannah Dustin, a 40-year-old Puritan woman, along with her nurse, Mary Neff, and a teenage captive, Samuel Leonardson, launched a deadly attack on their Abenaki captors. In a swift and brutal assault, they killed 10 people, including women and children, before fleeing into the wilderness. Their actions have been enshrined in history as an extraordinary tale of survival, yet they also raise profound questions about morality, colonial violence, and the fate of indigenous peoples. Hannah Dustin's story remains one of the most discussed and controversial episodes of early American history. To some, she is a symbol of resilience, a victim of brutal native raids who fought back against her captors. To others, her actions embody the ruthless and often genocidal nature of colonial expansion. Understanding her place in history requires examining the world she inhabited, the forces that shaped her fate, and the ongoing debate over her legacy. New England in the late 17th century, a land in turmoil. To fully grasp the circumstances of Hannah Dustin's captivity and escape, one must consider the broader context of late 17th century New England. This was a period of rapid colonial expansion, accompanied by frequent and violent conflicts between European settlers and indigenous peoples. The Puritans, who had established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the early 1600s, sought to create a religiously devout society governed by strict laws and agricultural self-sufficiency. However, their vision clashed with the reality of inhabiting land that was already home to well-established Native American tribes. Colonial expansion and conflict. The early years of European settlement in New England were marked by tension and warfare with indigenous groups, culminating in King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676. Led by the Wampanoag leader Metacomet, known to the English as King Philip, this devastating conflict saw Native resistance to colonial encroachment reach its peak. The war resulted in the widespread destruction of Native communities and the decimation of indigenous populations. Although the colonists ultimately prevailed, the war left behind deep mistrust, fear, and ongoing cycles of violence between settlers and Native American groups. By the time of Hannah Dustin's capture in 1697, the scars of King Philip's War were still fresh. The indigenous groups that had survived the conflict were often displaced, forced into marginal territories, or drawn into ongoing skirmishes with colonial militias. In these frontier regions, where settlers pushed deeper into native lands, violence and retribution became an inescapable part of daily life. King William's War and the struggle for control of the 1690s brought another wave of conflict with King William's War, 1688 to 1697, part of a larger struggle between England and France for dominance in North America. Indigenous groups, including the Abenaki, aligned themselves with the French, who had long-standing trade and military alliances with native tribes. For the Abenaki and their allies, the war was a fight to resist colonial expansion and protect their homelands. For English settlers, the war was a period of terror. Abenaki war parties, supported by the French, launched strategic raids on colonial towns, burning homes, taking captives, and disrupting English settlement efforts. These attacks were not random acts of violence, but rather part of a calculated effort to destabilize English control in the region. For frontier communities like Haverhill, Massachusetts, where Hannah Dustin and her family lived, life was marked by the constant threat of ambushes and raids. The raid on Haverhill, March 15, 1697. Haverhill, Massachusetts, was a small and vulnerable settlement along the Merrimack River. Like many Puritan frontier towns, it was founded on the promise of fertile farmland, but was constantly at risk from indigenous groups resisting colonial expansion. Hannah Dustin lived on a farm just outside the town center with her husband, Thomas Dustin, and their children. By 1697, they had 8 children, the youngest being an infant named Martha. Life in Haverhill was harsh and unpredictable. Women like Hannah Dustin were responsible for managing households, raising children, and supporting the agricultural demands of frontier life. However, The daily struggles of colonial survival were overshadowed by the looming threat of conflict. When the Abenaki launched a raid on Haverhill in the early morning hours of March 15, 1697, they set fire to homes, killed several settlers, and took captives, including Hannah and her newborn child. What followed would cement Hannah Dustin's place in history, both as a celebrated survivor and a figure of deep controversy. The raid on Haverhill, March 15, 1697. In the early hours of March 15, 1697, a group of Abenaki warriors, part of a larger force allied with the French, launched a swift and brutal raid on the frontier settlement of Haverhill, Massachusetts. Under the cover of darkness, they advanced undetected, striking without warning. The attack was devastating. Homes were set ablaze, settlers were killed, and captives were taken. Among those seized were Hannah Dustin, her nurse Mary Neff, and Hannah's infant daughter, Martha. At the time of the raid, Hannah's husband, Thomas Dustin, was in town. Upon hearing the attack, he rushed home in a desperate attempt to rescue his family. Engaging the raiders in a fierce skirmish, he managed to kill several attackers, but was ultimately unable to prevent his wife and child from being taken. As the Abenaki withdrew into the wilderness, they torched the Dustin home and slaughtered their livestock, leaving destruction in their wake. A harrowing journey into captivity following the raid. Hannah, Mary, and baby Martha were forced to embark on a grueling march northward into Abenaki territory. The journey covered over 100 miles through unforgiving winter conditions. For a Puritan woman accustomed to the structured life of a colonial settlement, the experience was both terrifying and disorienting. The Abenaki, like many indigenous groups, practiced a form of warfare that involved taking captives during raids. These prisoners were typically used for ransom, adoption into the tribe, or in some cases, execution. It is likely that Hannah and Mary were intended to be ransomed or traded, while the fate of baby Martha remained uncertain. The death of Martha, a tragic loss shortly after their capture, Hannah's infant daughter, Martha, was killed by their Abenaki captors. The exact circumstances of her death remain a subject of debate. According to some historical accounts, her skull was crushed, possibly to prevent her cries from alerting nearby settlers or colonial militias. However, the accuracy of this account has been questioned by some scholars. Regardless of the details, the loss of her child was a profound and devastating blow to Hannah, fueling both her grief and her eventual determination to escape. Life in captivity, uncertainty, and survival for several weeks. The captives were held by a band of Abenaki who, in a notable deviation from common practice, were reportedly Christian converts. Although they were not subjected to the extreme brutality that other captives sometimes endured, their situation remained precarious. They faced constant hunger, exposure to the elements, and the psychological torment of being torn from their homes and families. Despite some reported leniency, such as being allowed limited movement and occasional conversation with their captors, Hannah, Mary, and their fellow captive, Samuel Leonardson, knew that their survival was far from guaranteed. They remained constantly aware of the ever-present threat of violence and the uncertainty of their fate. The escape, a bold and bloody rebellion. As the weeks passed, Hannah and her companions resolved to escape. On the night of April 30th, 1697, while their captors slept in a small encampment near the Merrimack River, they seized their opportunity. Armed with hatchets they had secretly acquired, they launched a sudden and ruthless attack. In the cover of darkness, they struck swiftly, killing 10 of their captors, including men, women, and children. Only one woman and a child managed to flee. The attack was not only an act of survival, but also one of calculated retribution. Understanding the brutal realities of frontier warfare, Hannah took the scalps of the slain Abenaki, a practice that was common at the time, with colonial governments offering bounties for such trophies. While later accounts framed her actions as an act of heroism and justified retaliation, the event remains emblematic of the relentless cycle of violence that defined settler-indigenous relations in colonial New England. The journey home and Hannah Dustin's legacy with their captors dead, Hannah, Mary, and Samuel took a canoe and began the arduous journey southward. Paddling through the frigid waters of the Merrimack River, they navigated over 30 miles of dangerous terrain. Despite the risks, their escape was successful, and they eventually arrived safely back in Haverhill. Upon her return, Hannah Dustin was hailed as a frontier heroine. The colonial government, recognizing both her resilience and the scalp she had brought back, rewarded her with a bounty. She became a celebrated figure, her story immortalized in history as a testament to Puritan perseverance. However, her legacy remains deeply complex. To some, she symbolizes courage and survival against overwhelming odds. To others, her actions epitomize the violent and merciless nature of colonial expansion. Regardless of perspective, her story endures as one of the most contested and debated episodes in early American history. The legacy of Hannah Dustin, heroine or villain. In the centuries since her dramatic escape, Hannah Dustin's story has been told and retold in vastly different ways. To some, she is a symbol of Puritan resilience, a heroine who defied the odds and took decisive action to ensure her survival. To others, her story is a chilling reminder of the brutal cycle of colonial violence that led to the widespread displacement and suffering of indigenous peoples. The heroic narrative, a symbol of survival for many, Hannah Dustin embodies the archetype of the indomitable frontier survivor. Her daring escape and lethal retribution against her captors have long been framed as acts of self-defense, shaped by the brutal realities of captivity and the ever-present dangers faced by settlers on the colonial frontier. Her return to Haverhill as a victorious survivor brought her recognition and praise, and the colonial authorities commended her courage, awarding her a bounty for the scalps she had taken. Her story became woven into the fabric of early American legend, celebrated as an example of Puritan fortitude in the face of unimaginable hardship. A darker perspective, colonialism and cycles of violence yet. When viewed through the lens of history and the devastating impact of colonialism, Hannah Dustin's actions take on a far more troubling dimension. Her attack on the Abenaki was not an isolated act of survival, but part of a larger, relentless cycle of violence that characterized European expansion in the Americas. The scalping of her slain captors, once praised as a wartime trophy, can now be seen as emblematic of the larger system of settler colonialism, which displaced, subjugated, and in many cases, annihilated indigenous populations. Hannah Dustin's legacy forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions. Was she merely a victim reacting to the violence inflicted upon her? Or was she also a participant in a broader historical pattern of conquest and destruction? The answer is not simple, nor is it absolute. A legacy of complexity and reflection rather than viewing her story in stark terms of heroism or villainy. It is essential to understand Hannah Dustin within the greater historical forces that shaped her world. Her survival and violent escape are undeniable realities, but they must be examined alongside the devastating consequences of colonial expansion. Her actions, while extraordinary in their time, were part of a larger conflict that reshaped entire cultures, communities, and landscapes. Hannah Dustin's story, like many from early American history, evokes both admiration and critique. It is a testament to human resilience, but also a reflection of the painful and violent realities of colonialism. As we recount her legacy, we must acknowledge both the courage she displayed and the cost at which it came, not only to her and the settlers of New England, but also to the native peoples whose lands, lives, and cultures were irrevocably altered by the tides of European expansion.